January 17, 1940. Snow fell softly over the German countryside, muffling the rumble of industry beneath it. Inside a compound near Berlin, engineers were testing engines for new aircraft. Soldiers drilled in the cold, their breath turning to mist. Across Europe, nations were preparing for a war that had already begun. And in a quiet office within the Abwehr, German military intelligence, a handful of officers discussed an idea that would resurface years later, one that would become one of the strangest stories of the Second World War. The idea was simple in concept, but daring in execution. What if German soldiers could slip behind enemy lines, wearing the uniforms of their enemies, speaking their language, spreading confusion and fear from within? It was a seed planted early, nurtured by a belief that deception was as powerful as artillery. In the years to come, that seed would be handed to a man named Otto Skorzeny. By 1943, Skorzeny had become a legend. He was tall, scar-faced from a fencing duel in his youth, and fiercely loyal to Hitler. His rescue of Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop prison had made him the most famous commando in the Reich. Hitler called him the most dangerous man in Europe. Skorzeny called himself simply a soldier, one who believed that wars were not only fought with bullets, but with illusions. In 1944, as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, that illusion would be all the Reich had left. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris had been liberated. German armies were falling back across France and Belgium, and Hitler, desperate to change the momentum, devised one last offensive, a plan to drive through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, and capture the port of Antwerp. It would be called the Ardennes Offensive, or as history remembers it, the Battle of the Bulge. But to make it work, Hitler wanted more than tanks and artillery. He wanted confusion. He turned to Skorzeny. "Find a way," Hitler ordered, "to make the enemy distrust itself." Skorzeny's plan was named Operation Greif, meaning Griffin. Its purpose was to send German commandos dressed in captured American uniforms and driving Allied vehicles deep behind enemy lines. Their tasks were simple: cut telephone lines, change road signs, redirect convoys, and sabotage fuel dumps. But their true weapon was not dynamite. It was deception. At first, even within the German High Command, the idea was controversial. Some argued it violated the laws of war. The Geneva Convention forbade combatants from disguising themselves as enemy soldiers during battle, but Hitler approved it personally. "In this war," he said, "law is written by the victor." And so, the training began. In October 1944, Skorzeny assembled more than 500 men for his secret unit. They were handpicked from the Waffen-SS, the Luftwaffe, and the regular army. The key requirement wasn't marksmanship or courage. It was English. Yet of the 500, only about 44 could speak fluent English. The rest had to learn quickly. At the Friedenthal Commando School near Berlin, language instructors drilled them in American slang and idioms. They memorized baseball teams, comic book characters, and city names. They practiced salutes and handshakes. "We had to learn how to say okay the American way," one recruit later recalled. "We even practiced how to chew gum like them." Uniforms were obtained from captured stockpiles. US jeeps and trucks were repainted with American markings. German weapons were replaced with Thompsons and Garans, when possible. Some even received American cigarettes and chocolate bars. On paper, it was perfect. But in reality, it was fragile. One slip of language, one wrong gesture, could mean death. As winter approached, the plan moved into its final phase. Hitler's great counteroffensive would begin on December 16, 1944. Operation Greif would move in just behind the front. By then, the Germans were desperate. The Reich's cities were burning under Allied bombs. The Eastern Front was collapsing. But in the West, Hitler saw one last opportunity. If his forces could reach Antwerp, the Allies might sue for peace, or at least buy Germany time. On December 10, 1944, Skorzeny met with his men for the last briefing. The snow outside had turned the forest white. Inside, the room was lit only by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. He told them what was at stake. "You are to become Americans," he said. You will think like them, speak like them, and move like them. You will be soldiers without a flag. And if you are captured—" He paused. "You know the penalty." The men nodded. They knew. The punishment for fighting in enemy uniform was execution as a spy. There would be no mercy, no prisoner exchanges. Still, they volunteered. Skorzeny later wrote, "They did not do it for Hitler or for me, but because they believed a small group might still make a difference." For the next 6 days, the disguised units moved toward the front. They carried false identification papers and memorized cover stories, their supposed hometowns, ranks, and units. They were divided into small jeep teams, usually 4 men each. Their mission: infiltrate Allied lines once the offensive began and create chaos wherever possible. At dawn on December 16th, the Ardennes erupted. The first German artillery shells screamed over the forest, shattering the silence. Allied soldiers, caught off guard, stumbled from their tents and foxholes. The offensive had begun with over 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks pressing westward. In the confusion, Skorzeny's disguised men slipped through the gaps. American troops reported seeing familiar vehicles moving through the snow, jeeps with white stars painted on their sides. Drivers wore US helmets, their uniforms perfect, their English believable. They saluted correctly. They used the right radio codes. Only subtle details were wrong: a missing patch, a strange accent, or the wrong slang word. One US unit near Malmedy received orders from what appeared to be an American officer, telling them to retreat east. They did, right into German lines. Another column was diverted when infiltrators turned road signs backward. At first, the US command thought these were rumors, but by December 18th, it was clear. German soldiers were operating in American uniforms. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, no one could be trusted. Military police began setting up roadblocks, stopping every vehicle, every jeep, every convoy, demanding passwords and asking questions only Americans could answer. Some were simple. What's the capital of Illinois? Others were stranger. Who won the World Series in 1942? It was here, amid the snow and fear, that baseball entered the war. The roads of the Ardennes were a labyrinth of snow, mud, and panic. Convoys moved blindly through blizzards and artillery fire. Radios crackled with half-heard orders. Somewhere in the chaos, American soldiers began to suspect that not every jeep wearing the White Star was friendly. At first, the stories sounded absurd. A jeep of Americans turned a column the wrong way. A bridge was blown up by our own men. Someone changed the road signs in the night. The front was full of rumors, and rumor in war spreads faster than gunfire. But soon the rumors had names, and the names had faces. In one captured diary from a German officer in Operation Greif, a note read, "Confusion is our greatest weapon. The Americans trust their uniforms more than their own eyes." It worked. For the first 48 hours, Skorzeny's infiltrators moved freely across the front. Dressed in authentic US uniforms, they carried forged papers and spoke in clipped, confident English. Their missions were simple: misdirect, disrupt, and disappear. They flipped road signs, gave false directions to entire battalions, and even changed bridge markers to send tanks into swamps. Private Robert Parker of the 2nd Armored Division recalled, "We met a jeep with 4 GIs waving us down. They told us Bastogne had fallen. We almost turned back. Then I noticed their driver's boots, black German leather. Not American issue. That's when we raised our rifles." Such moments became terrifyingly common. American MPs began setting up roadblocks at every crossroads. By December 19th, suspicion had become policy. No vehicle passed without being questioned. But how do you tell a real American soldier from a German who's learned the language? The MPs had to improvise. They began asking questions that no spy could prepare for. Questions that lived in the hearts of Americans, not in manuals or maps. What's the capital of Illinois? Who's the governor of California? What team does Joe DiMaggio play for? What's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Questions so ordinary, they became weapons of war. And one question in particular would become legend: who won the World Series? To a German spy trained for months in English, baseball was a mystery, but to an American, it was instinct. The right answer came not with hesitation, but with the easy pride of home. Military Police Sergeant Ed Kavanaugh recalled years later, "We caught 3 of them that way. They spoke good English, but when I asked who won the series, they just looked at each other. One said, 'The Yankees.' I knew right there they were dead men." The captured infiltrators were interrogated quickly. Some were shot within hours. The laws of war were clear. Fighting in enemy uniform meant death by firing squad. At the 5th US Army headquarters, 4 German soldiers posing as Americans were caught trying to cut a phone line. When questioned, they claimed to be from the 5th Rangers, but they couldn't name their commanding officer. They were executed that evening by a 12-man firing squad. In a report dated December 23, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Harold L. Mack wrote, 4 enemy agents, disguised as US soldiers, were apprehended at Iwile. All 4 were executed in accordance with the rules of war after confession. Those confessions revealed how deeply the operation had infiltrated Allied lines. Skorzeny's men had reached within 20 miles of the Meuse River. Some even entered captured towns still held by US forces. The deception had worked far better than the German command expected, but also far shorter than they hoped. Word of the impostors spread through the American ranks like wildfire. Soldiers began doubting everyone, even their own officers. Men were arrested for having the wrong accent or for hesitating before answering a question. One lieutenant was detained because he couldn't remember the capital of his home state under pressure. Another was nearly shot for calling gasoline petrol, a habit picked up from British allies. As the paranoia grew, so did the tension. Checkpoints became gauntlets of suspicion. Jeeps were stopped, their drivers pulled out at gunpoint. Soldiers were ordered to show dog tags, then were quizzed about baseball, Hollywood, and American slang. Some checkpoints even used a trick of tone. MPs would ask, "What's the score?" If the soldier answered, "Score of what?" he was likely German. If he shot back, "Who's winning?" he passed. For days, this odd cultural test became the line between life and death. Baseball, a game born in American fields, had become a weapon in a European war. Meanwhile, Skorzeny's men continued to operate in the shadows. They sabotaged roads, planted false minefield signs, and radioed fake orders. A few even managed to capture American fuel trucks, desperately needed by advancing German tanks. But the mission was unraveling. Allied intelligence had intercepted reports confirming Operation Greif. The Allies even printed leaflets warning troops to beware of Germans dressed as GIs. Skorzeny himself became a phantom of rumour. Soldiers began whispering that he had entered Allied lines disguised as a US general, plotting to assassinate Eisenhower. By Christmas, paranoia had reached the highest levels of command. Eisenhower was placed under armed guard in his own headquarters in Versailles. Every staff officer was ordered to show identification and answer personal questions before entry. For 3 days, the Supreme Allied Commander effectively became a prisoner of his own army, trapped by the fear of impostors. General Omar Bradley later called it the most extraordinary outbreak of suspicion I ever saw in the war. In the field, it was worse. Entire convoys were delayed for hours as MPs cross-examined drivers. Some units even fired on their own when uniforms and insignia appeared uncertain in the fog and snow. The Germans had wanted confusion, and they got it. For the men of Operation Greif, the mission was both success and suicide. Their disguises gave them a brief ghost-like power, but every step deeper into Allied territory increased their risk of discovery. Captured documents reveal that by December 22nd, most of the infiltration teams had been wiped out or caught. Some were executed on the spot, others vanished into the forest, freezing or starving before reaching their lines. One captured operative, Corporal Gunther Billing, described his final days in an Allied interrogation record. "We drove a jeep until the fuel ran out. We walked for 2 days. We ate snow. We could hear Americans talking near the roads. We were afraid to move, afraid to sleep. I was caught when I tried to light a cigarette." Billing survived the war and later testified at Skorzeny's trial. Many of his comrades did not. For the Americans, the cost of paranoia was real. In one tragic incident, at a checkpoint near Liège, a nervous MP shot an approaching jeep without warning. The driver was a decorated American major. He died instantly. By late December, the Battle of the Bulge had turned decisively against Germany. The weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and the offensive began to crumble. Operation Greif, bold, imaginative, and desperate, had failed to achieve its main objectives. The bridges to the Meuse remained in Allied hands. Still, the psychological impact lingered long after the last infiltrator was captured. The idea that the enemy could look exactly like you, speak your language, and walk among your men. It haunted soldiers for months. An American private wrote in a letter home, "You don't forget that kind of fear. It's worse than bombs. At least you can see bombs." As 1945 began, Skorzeny himself was ordered back to Germany. He reported that only a handful of his original 500 men had returned. Yet Hitler praised him, calling the mission a brilliant psychological blow. In truth, it was a futile one. Germany's armies were in retreat. The Reich was collapsing. And no amount of disguise could hide that. In the spring of 1945, when the war finally ended, Allied investigators rounded up the remnants of Operation Greif. They found detailed training manuals, lists of fake American identities, and even photographs of soldiers posing in US uniforms. Those documents became key evidence in what came next, the Nuremberg military tribunals. Skorzeny was arrested in May 1945 and imprisoned at Dachau. In 1947, he was put on trial for war crimes, specifically for the illegal use of enemy uniforms during combat. The prosecution argued that his commandos had violated the laws of war by fighting as Americans, but Skorzeny defended himself with cold precision. He cited instances where Allied commandos, including British SAS and American Rangers, had used enemy uniforms during raids, not to kill, but to infiltrate. He insisted his men had only worn US uniforms to penetrate lines, never to fire while disguised. In one of the most remarkable moments of the trial, 2 British officers testified in his defense. They confirmed that their own units had, at times, worn German uniforms for reconnaissance. On September 9, 1947, Otto Skorzeny was acquitted. He stood in the courtroom, his face expressionless as the verdict was read. Not guilty. To some, he was a war criminal who escaped justice. To others, he was a soldier who exploited the thin line between strategy and crime. After his release, Skorzeny fled to Spain, where he lived quietly for decades. He never denied his part in Operation Greif. In interviews, he called it a necessary deception, adding, "We fought a war of nations, not gentlemen. We used what we had." Back in America, the story became legend. Soldiers told it to new recruits as a warning and a tale of ingenuity. For many, the lesson was not about espionage, it was about identity. That in a war where technology and machinery had grown monstrous, the simplest things still mattered most: a name, an accent, a game of baseball. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed east into Germany, they discovered the ruins of a war built on lies. Skorzeny's operation was only one of many desperate tricks: phantom armies, fake radio chatter, false orders. Deception had become the final refuge of a regime unwilling to face the truth. But for the men in the snow that winter, the story remained personal. They remembered the cold, the suspicion, and the strange comfort of a question about baseball, a question that could decide who lived and who died. Private Jack Riley of the 84th Infantry later wrote, "That winter, we didn't trust uniforms. We trusted answers. And if a man didn't know who played center field for the Yankees, we didn't let him pass." The Ardennes forest lay silent again by February 1945. Charred tanks rested beneath the snow. Broken helmets, frozen rifles, and tire tracks told the story of men who had vanished into the mist. The last echoes of the Battle of the Bulge faded with the melting ice, but one memory remained: the strange, eerie fear that the man beside you might not be who he seemed. For the Allied troops, Operation Greif became a symbol of how deeply deception could wound trust. Units that had survived artillery fire and ambush now carried a quieter scar: suspicion. Even weeks later, patrols still stopped each other on the roads, flashing passwords, repeating baseball questions, and hesitating before shaking hands. The enemy had failed to break their lines, but had shaken their faith in certainty itself. When news spread that Otto Skorzeny had been captured, there was both relief and fascination. To many American soldiers, his name had become myth, whispered in the dark like a ghost story. "They say he can speak perfect English," one sergeant wrote home. "They say he's still out there, dressed like one of us." Skorzeny was interrogated at length by Allied intelligence. Calm, confident, he described Operation Greif not as a crime, but as a military ruse, a soldier's trick. He insisted his men had not fought while disguised, only infiltrated. And for that distinction, lives would hang in the balance. During his trial at Dachau, prosecutors read witness statements from captured commandos. Some had confessed to planting mines, redirecting convoys, and carrying explosives while dressed in American uniforms. Skorzeny stood motionless as the accusations were read. He neither denied nor apologized. Instead, he quoted history. "Your own commandos in Italy," he said, "wore German coats to enter our lines. The difference between us and you is not our uniforms, but who writes the verdict." The court deliberated for 2 months. In the end, his defense, bolstered by testimony from British officers who confirmed that similar tactics were used by Allied forces, convinced the judges. Otto Skorzeny was acquitted. He would never again fight a war, but his legend only grew. He fled to Spain, lived under the protection of Franco's government, and became a figure of intrigue, a soldier without a nation, moving through post-war Europe's shadows. Decades later, historians would still debate Operation Greif's significance. Militarily, it failed. Not one bridge on the Meuse was captured. Strategically, it barely delayed the Allied advance. But psychologically, it left a deep mark. Proof that warfare wasn't just about guns and tanks, but belief. The idea that uniform and language could no longer guarantee identity terrified men who had once trusted both without question. The simple baseball test, absurd, almost comical, became a defense against invisible enemies. It wasn't about the answer. It was about instinct. A real American didn't have to think before saying Cardinals or Yankees. That instinct, that small flicker of cultural memory, became the line between truth and death. Private James Hollander wrote in his diary after the war, "We stopped a jeep near Stavelot. They had the right badges, right papers, even the right slang. But when I asked who played shortstop for Brooklyn, they froze. I still remember their faces, young, scared, maybe my age. I wish I could forget, but you don't forget when a game decides who lives." By spring, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the paranoia slowly faded. Roadblocks came down, passwords were retired, and soldiers began to smile again. Yet some habits lingered. At mess halls across Europe, it became a running joke. Hey, who won the World Series? It was humor born from horror, laughter to bury fear. In the years that followed, Operation Greif was studied in military academies around the world. It became a case study in psychological warfare, how deception could fracture an army more effectively than a bullet. Intelligence officers wrote reports praising its ingenuity, but condemning its moral cost. The line between lawful ruse and forbidden disguise had never been thinner. Otto Skorzeny died in 1975 in Madrid, still unrepentant. In one of his last interviews, he said, "A soldier's duty is to win, not to play fair." For him, the war had never ended. It had merely changed its weapons. For the men who faced his infiltrators, fairness was all that separated them from madness. They had learned, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, that identity was fragile, that courage, suspicion, and memory could exist in the same breath. Historians estimate that fewer than 50 German soldiers successfully infiltrated American lines during Operation Greif. Most were captured or killed within days. Yet the impact of those few was enormous. Over 20,000 US troops were delayed by security checks. Hundreds were detained on suspicion. Even General Eisenhower's own security was doubled. For a brief, surreal moment, an entire army questioned itself. And in that moment, the war became not just a clash of nations, but of minds. Imagine it. The white fog of December 1944, a jeep idling at a snowy crossroads, 4 men shivering under their helmets. An MP leans into the light, flashlight beams sweeping across their faces. "Where you boys headed?" he asks. "St. Vith, sir," the driver replies. "Road's clear?" The MP narrows his eyes. "Maybe. But tell me, pal, who won the series?" A pause. Just 1 second too long. "Yankees." And that's how it ended for them. Not with a firefight, not with heroics, but with a single question about a game half a world away. When the war finally ended, baseball returned home before many of its players did. Soldiers coming back from Europe filled the stands again, the crack of the bat, the smell of dust and grass. They were reminders that normal life could return, that the world could heal. For those who had fought in the Ardennes, baseball would never be just a game again. It had saved lives. It had unmasked killers. It had been, in its own strange way, a weapon of truth. An old veteran once told a journalist, "You can teach a man to shoot like an American, talk like an American, but you can't teach him to care about baseball." That, more than any bullet or bomb, was what stopped Operation Greif. The story of the German infiltrators fades quietly into history, overshadowed by the grander battles that followed. The Rhine crossings, the fall of Berlin, the liberation of Europe. But beneath those vast events lies this smaller tale, human, peculiar, and deeply revealing. It reminds us that wars are not only fought with steel and fire, but with memory and belonging. That a uniform can be copied, a salute imitated, but culture, the small truths that live in a person's heart, cannot. In the end, a question about a baseball game exposed the limits of deception. It revealed that even amid chaos and death, something uniquely human, a shared story, a familiar name, a childhood pastime, could still guard the truth. And so, the lesson of Operation Greif endures. Not in tactics or strategy, but in something far simpler. That identity is not in what we wear, but in what we remember. Fade out. Slow piano. Archival footage of soldiers laughing near a jeep, tossing a baseball in the snow. The ball rises, caught in midair, and freezes in black and white. Once, in a war of deception, it was not a bullet, but a baseball that told the truth.